Why does it feel like when Five Nights at Freddy's chooses to go on for centuries, the community just accepts it that way, but when Poppy Playtime does something similar, it's met with
enough! Tired of it. So tired of it. I think that there was like emotional core here that was trying to shine through, and it's like I wanted to be in it, but by the time I got there, I didn't care.
As you probably are well aware, Poppy Playtime Chapter 5 just got released and it was met with anger from every part of the internet. But my question is, why? Why did this fail so desperately compared to Chapter 3 and 4? And more so, why did it fail compared to FNAF? When FNAF ends with an open ending, it's expected and understood, yet when Poppy does it, it's not. Why does such similar game get treated in such different ways? To really understand that, we need to deep dive into storytelling techniques. I know, so much fun, but what is even more fun is if you're able to like this video before I finish this sentence. I'm trying to hit 1 like, so if I'm able to, please help me out. And I'm also trying to hit 1 subscribers at the end of the year. Telling a story can be broken down into as many steps as you want, and every writer on earth will tell you that their specific technique of writing is the correct one. You shouldn't listen to anyone else, you should just buy their premium subscription because they have figured it out that no one else has. Yeah, I'm sorry to all the fans, starting from Dan Harmon, Hero's Journey, Frank Daniel, Paul Giulio, the Hollywood 3-act 8 sequences, or the simplified AI DA model. Point being that it doesn't fucking matter. Telling a satisfying story is kind of like seeing a spectrum of colors. Where you decide to draw the line of where orange ends and red starts doesn't really matter because it's all part of the same rainbow. All of the ways to read the spectrum are just different and you're just choosing how complicated you want to get. It doesn't really mean that one is more correct than another. I'm telling you all of this because I'm gonna use Christian Thompson's story model, and I don't want to hear any complaints in the comments, but this video is gonna be based on that, but it wouldn't matter which one I would choose. They're just built on the same principle and they're working in the same way. Christian Thompson's 4-act starts with the setup. This is when your character starts the journey and they have a goal in mind and they're trying to reach this goal. Then we get into the complication. This is when your main character experiences some problems that they have to overcome to be able to reach their goal. Then we get to the development. This is when the character has a change of heart or the goal changes usually in some way. It doesn't have to. They kind of realize the root to the problem and they realize that their actions have been wrong and they have to change somehow. Maybe the goal doesn't change, but their approach to the goal maybe changes. And then the climax. This is when they either reach or don't reach the goal, depending on the story. And I don't think Poppy Playtimes is handling the 4 stages of this storytelling in a very good way. The setup, I would say, is the entirety of Chapter 1. You're learning your character and what you're doing there and why you're there. You don't really understand it, but you're starting to get the intrigue of this world. Then I would say that the complication starts in Chapter 2, when you meet Mommy Longlegs, when you realize that these monsters are gonna be oncoming and gonna be a continuous problem. You could also argue that Huggy Wuggy in Chapter 1 is also a part of that. I would buy that. But what is clear is at the end of Chapter 2, this is when the train derails, literally. such a dumb pun. And you are launched further into the toy factory. This is a very clear example where the goal changes. The goal goes from just escaping to actually trying to help these kids. We get to Chapter 3. And I would say we're still in the development, because now we have a new goal and we're trying a new approach to get this goal. Doesn't change that much, but our mindset has definitely changed. This is when they're starting to hint at the prototype and you realize that he is actually more important than he lets on. But then we get to Chapter 4 and we are still in the development. They are obviously telling multiple stories at once, so sometimes the development is part of the larger narrative but isn't necessarily part of the episode story. But the problem with that is that every episode story is kind of connected to the main story, which makes it feel like every story, every chapter, every little story has a restart and a new complication and a new setup and a new development. Now let's move on to Five Nights at Freddy's, a franchise with a never-ending story. So how do they keep this balance? Well, the difference, I would say, is that there isn't really a and B plot that is very clear. For example, in the first game, there is a setup, complication, development, and ending all in the first game. That's what makes the first game so satisfying and so intriguing for an audience. But it also tells the overarching story of Michael Afton. So, what is this story that they tell in the game? Well, it is literally the newspaper clippings. Kids vanish from local pizzeria. Bodies not found. That's the setup. Children disappears. Police thinks it's related to someone dressed up. 5 children are now reported missing. Suspect now convicted. The complication: more children, now they know that it's related to someone dressed up. And the bodies are not found. Local pizzeria threatened to shut down over sanitation. The development: animatronic smells and reeks of blood. These are getting to the root of the problem, that they are actually stuffed inside of the suit. Local pizzeria said to be closed by year end. The climax: this is when the conclusion to the story comes, and a quote from the CEO saying that the characters will live on, a hint to the game. So the only other stories being told here is the Michael Afton story, but the only part of this is the setup. The only setup we get in this is that Michael Afton is here and he keeps coming back to the same place, even though it doesn't really make sense why. And just before I continue, I'm just gonna talk to this story as if it's planned, because it doesn't really matter if it's planned or not, like relating to all of this, because this is definitely something that Scott Cawthon thought about while writing Five Nights at Freddy's. Even if it's after or before, it doesn't matter. This is something he definitely kept in mind, but it doesn't matter if it's thought about in retrospect or if it's thought about before he made the first game. Doesn't matter. That's how it is. That is why the first Five Nights at Freddy's games has a setup yet still feels satisfying, because it still has a conclusion. Let's move on to Five Nights at Freddy's 2. This story is being told through the phone calls. Hello and welcome to your new summer job. This is the continuation of Michael Afton's story, or the story of a guard working there. So this is actually not related to the story of Five Nights at Freddy's 2. Five Nights at Freddy's 2 story starts after. I never liked that puppet thing. It's always thinking. This is the setup. This is when you realize that everything is maybe not quite as it should be, and this beginning of the story is starting to be told. Rumors you might have heard lately, this is the complication. This is the problems that you might be coming into and your character might be experiencing, but it isn't the root to the problem. We're getting to the root of the problem with there's been somewhat of an investigation going on. This is the development. This is a clear root to the problem. Why William Afton is going around killing people. Oh, you didn't get the memo? The place is closed down. This is the climax. And so what, does Poppy Playtime not do small stories? We just went over that they did. And yes, they do. They do with Doughy and Catnap and Mommy Longlegs. But the difference is that they're supposed to be integral to the main story, and therefore it doesn't really have a climax. Yes, they die, but that doesn't really feel like a climax because you don't get a conclusion. You're expecting a conclusion in future games, and when you, instead of getting a conclusion, just gets a new character and the whole circle restarts, it doesn't feel satisfying. It feels like you're just dragging it along. Because that's the problem. It feels like you're just dragging it along. But the question is why? Because you can have a franchise that's been going on for 100 years without feeling like it's dragging. But they have been going on just for a couple of years and it feels like they're dragging. That's a problem. That's a problem with the story. Making a game like this, you need to balance telling short stories and telling an overarching story. For example, if you go back to Five Nights at Freddy's 2, the only information we get about the overarching story is that the killer is back. It's directly connected to the first game. And the security guard gets fired for the same reason. It's being told in such a subtle way, so it's not annoying for anyone that is trying to just enjoy the game as it is. Hey, this is Editing, and I just want to be adding that one big part of why I think this is making a big difference unintentionally is that Five Nights at Freddy's is split into different games, while Poppy Playtime is split into different chapters. That is unintentionally giving off the information that you are not longer expected to have a conclusion, as long as you don't expect the chapter to be the last chapter. I think that is very much giving into the creators of Poppy Playtime to not create a narrative that feels satisfying, because they don't have to. Five Nights at Freddy's can end at 2 or 3 or 4 because each story is self-containing. This is part of the complication, which leads us to the development, or the fake climax. Yes, a fake climax is pretty common, and it's a very usual way to have a development where you get to the root of the problem, but you're not managing to defeat it. It's a very common way to make the audience feel like a false set of comfort before you hit them with the real punch. And just to be clear, FNAF 3 was not the ending. It was never the ending. It could have been. He could have ended it if he wanted to, but it was a clear setup not to be the ending, because it wasn't supposed to be the ending. It says that he survived after the fire, or it's implied that he survived, so I don't think it's a coincidence that he continued making games afterwards. I don't think he just jumped on it because it was continuing going to get that bag. I don't believe that. And if FNAF 3 was supposed to be the real ending, then he should have a clearer development to hype up the ending. That's how you make a more satisfying story. Sure, he might not be intentionally making a satisfying story. He might just be a bad writer. That is definitely an argument, and I haven't made a video about that. How that, I don't know what corner, but somewhere I feel like it should appear. And that's really interesting. FNAF 4 is mainly telling the story of the crying child. Yes, the dreams are probably from Michael, but the story is about Cece. And he has his complete story in one game. Makes it satisfying to play. Almost every game is very satisfying to play and doesn't require anything except for Sister Location. Sister Location has a clear build-up and a bit of a climax, yet it's crystal clear that the game overall is the development. You're waiting for the big bang, and the big bang is Pizzeria Simulator. That is the climax. But then the question is, how did they continue after? How was it still satisfying, making a satisfying story afterwards when the story was supposed to end at Pizzeria Simulator? Why does UCN feel like a climax as well, and feels like a satisfying conclusion as well? Because UCN is not the climax to Mike's story, it's to the MCI children. Mike's story has been told, it had its steps, and it was concluded at Pizzeria Simulator. The satisfying part comes and it ends, and that's it. The MCI, however, the Pizza Simulator, that's their development. They didn't really have a big part of Sister Location, so they had mostly just their setup in FNAF 1, and then in FNAF 2 and FNAF 3 they had their complication. And then in Sister Location and Pizza Simulator, that's when they have their development. UCN is their climax, that's their conclusion. Because that's what FNAF is doing that I don't think Poppy is doing. They're telling multiple stories at the same time and having conclusions at different times, so everything still feels satisfying. They can conclude something, yet they have something to continue off on. I don't think this is intentional, but I think it's an extremely fundamental part of how Scott Cawthon is telling his stories. He is writing what he feels like. He is not planning everything, and he's writing what he thinks is the most natural and the most progressive part of the story, what progresses the story in the best way. But he does so in chunks. I also think Scott's use of irony shields him from complaints from the audience, especially with the "I always come back" being Springtrap's catchphrase, but also being a reference to old cartoonish villains who never seem to back out, to always seem to disappear and then reappear. It's much more risky to do something that Poppy Playtime did, where they actually have a villain come in and then disappear, but not do it in an ironic sense. It's much more vulnerable. And I think Poppy Playtime's take on seriousness in their story compared to FNAF is being exploited as their weakness, because it is much, then you expect something much grander. FNAF's approach to irony, I think, is very interesting debate, because I'm very split two ways. In one side, I think pointing out mistakes and just commenting on them is a way lazier way to approach a problem than to actually try to fix it. Actually take a stand and try to do something about it. That is much more harder and it's much more vulnerable. On the other side, irony is such a skeleton of FNAF. From the first dialogue, I don't think FNAF is FNAF without its ironic commentary on the real world. Irony isn't just making a mistake and hoping people will forgive you because you mentioned the mistake, but it's also to pull it to its comically extreme, to make a stand for it, because to make a stand for change is the first step of change. Another clear example of telling stories intertwined is the whole Mimic saga and Edwin. The Mimic has gotten its setup, complication, development, and now we're waiting for the payoff, but Edwin has gotten his setup and his complication. Sure, we don't need a satisfying story about Edwin, we can stop where we are right now. He's not one of the most important characters, but if Stillwell or Scott wants to continue the story, they can. I can go on and on, but my point is telling a story out of sync is actually very helpful for the development of that story. It can be very satisfying for the audience to get that payoff, and it isn't really a genius way to tell a story. I'm not saying that, but it's clearly not how Poppy Playtime is writing its story right now. In Poppy Playtime Chapter 4, that's treated like the development, which means that Chapter 5 should lead to the conclusion. That is the reason so many people are mad at Poppy Playtime Chapter 5, because instead of getting a climax, we got another development. We got a build up again. It felt like we were taking 2 steps back. It felt like we were not getting anywhere. And that is frustrating. Mob Entertainment never said that this is the last chapter, this is where it ends. But we just assumed, because that's where the story was heading. That's how they were telling the story. You gotta think about how you tell a story to tell a story. Otherwise, it won't work. Otherwise, people will find it frustrating. It will seem like you don't know what you're doing. It was a development with not a hint of climax. They are literally edging us, and that pun is sadly intended. And the saddest part is that Chapter 5 is not even a bad chapter. It's a good chapter. It's just a good development. They should have reorganized how they did Chapter 4 and 3, shorten it down, maybe change the pacing of it, or deleted part of it, and had Chapter 5 instead, because it's a great development. We just didn't expect a development, and you have to prime the audience for a development so they will be comfortable with the development. And if Chapter 6 isn't the climax, you're gonna get hell on earth mob games. I hope you understand that. But then we have the real problem about writing stories, and that's the ending. And Drew Gooden has an amazing video about this, so check it out if you're interested. But making a setup and a complication is pretty easy, especially if you write the story as it goes. You can add anything you want. You don't really have to have a reason for it, because if you're planning out the story, then you have to think, okay, how will this help the story and come back in a positive yet a subversive way? No, you can just add things that you think are cool to make a cool story, and it works. The problem is when you have too many loose threads and you have to tie them up in a satisfying way to write them into a pattern that makes sense. Otherwise, the time and energy the audience put into that threads are gonna feel almost like an insult. And I'm not saying that Mob Games is doing that. I am saying that they better not be doing that in the next chapter. They're already on thin ice, messing up the story structure. They're gonna be on thinner ice if they do it again. And then people will point to anything. They will call them greedy, even though I don't think that is what's going on. if they were greedy, they would have ended the story and did a new setup with a new continuation, because that will spawn so much more money than doing what they're doing now. Yeah, but that's it. That's all for me. Please check out the video that is on screen right now. I worked on it. I think it's the FNAF video about why we don't think Scott Cawthon is a good writer and why that is actually good for the FNAF community. I find this video extremely interesting, and if you're interested, then check it out. I think it's a good one. Thank you so much for watching. Bye!